although the punitive tariffs still stand, reaching as high as 145% or even 245% in some cases. Their actual impact has significantly diminished. Why? As long as the tariffs aren't applied globally and uniformly, Chinese consumer goods can easily enter the US market through rerouting and rebranding. To make matters more perplexing, Trump even exempted high-tech Chinese products like semiconductors, communication equipment, and computers, which are less amenable to such workarounds. As a result, these so-called historic tariffs have become a hollow threat, effectively toothless. What's behind Trump's actions? It's clear he's trying to backpedal and extend an olive branch to China. However, China has refused to budge, responding with a firm counterattack. The US has since faced a triple whammy in its stocks, bonds, and currency markets. In particular, the rapid rise in US Treasury yields has struck at Trump's vulnerable point. Forced to abandon his haughty stance, he has tried to signal goodwill towards China. But this time, China isn't biting. While the US has been sending frequent signals of de-escalation, China remains non-committal, making it crystal clear: lift the tariffs first, then we'll talk. From a logical perspective, China's stance is beyond reproach. So-called reciprocal tariffs are nothing but blatant extortion, a scheme to gain without giving. Why should China engage when the unjust tariffs remain in place? However, from an emotional standpoint, it does seem like an impossible demand for Trump. Cancelling the tariffs would amount to a public admission of defeat to China. Since taking office 3 months ago, none of Trump's major policies have been successfully implemented. They've all ended in failure. Yet, he has persistently maintained a facade of winning to preserve his political legitimacy among his blue-collar supporters. Anti-China sentiment is a key pillar of his foreign policy in the eyes of these voters. Under such circumstances, getting Trump to admit his mistakes is next to impossible. It seems inevitable that the US-China tariff war, after this brief lull, will reignite, and perhaps with even greater ferocity. The question remains, why isn't China seizing the opportunity to de-escalate? The $360 billion trade surplus between China and the US isn't a trivial sum. It's crucial for countless businesses and workers. Is China really willing to risk a complete decoupling just to make a point? This seems inconsistent with China's pragmatic diplomatic tradition, which has always prioritized substance over appearance. Trump's unpredictability is certainly a factor. Agreements made today can be discarded tomorrow. It's undoubtedly challenging to negotiate with someone so unreliable. But even considering this, following the logic of delaying one day is one day, and decoupling one day later can make one more day of profit. Delay decoupling for one more day to gain more profit. One would expect China to at least maintain a facade of cooperation rather than taking an uncompromising stance. The most plausible explanation is that China may have orchestrated this tariff war. On the surface, it appears that Trump initiated it, but in reality, China might have been waiting for this moment, setting a trap and preparing to turn the tables on the US. This theory may sound far-fetched, but without it, it's difficult to explain China's unwavering and aggressive response, or why, even after Trump's concessions, China continues to put pressure on him, offering no room for retreat. What, then, is China's ultimate goal? What prize could be so enticing that China is willing to risk a complete breakdown in economic relations with the US and the loss of a $360 billion trade surplus? In my view, there's only one temptation great enough: undermining the credibility of the US dollar and claiming a portion of its global market share. To understand this, we must first ask, why does China trade with the US? Why does China sell its products to Americans at low prices? The answer is simple: to make money. But what exactly is money in the international context? In today's world, only the US dollar is recognized as a universal currency for international transactions. Other currencies are either pegged to the dollar or have limited domestic circulation. The dollar's status as the world's reserve currency allows countries to purchase resources and goods globally. We exchange our hard-earned products for green paper printed by the US because of the dollar's global acceptance. It's an absurd system, but it's the current global economic reality. So, why can the US sell its currency while others can't? The dollar's dominance is built on the US's national credibility, specifically its technological, military, and financial hegemonies. Those who challenge the US are subdued by these three powerful pillars. Other countries lack the means to promote their own currencies globally or enforce their use, so they have no choice but to accept the US-imposed rules. However, China is no ordinary country. In terms of technology, Made in China 2025 has exceeded expectations. China has caught up with the West in most areas, lagging only in a few cutting-edge technologies. Militarily, China has witnessed a surge in defense innovation in recent years. While the US military has underperformed, China has achieved overall parity with the US in military technology and even surpassed it in some fields. Although China still lags in terms of existing military resources, given its overwhelming military production capacity compared to the US, this gap is not insurmountable. Additionally, as the world's largest industrial power, China boasts the most comprehensive and efficient industrial system, with production capacity exceeding that of the G7 countries combined. In this regard, the industrialized US pales in comparison. Overall, China has overtaken the US in fundamental hard power. The only remaining gap lies in finance, where China's global influence still lags behind. But this is no longer a decisive obstacle. As the adage goes, economic base determines the superstructure. Financial strength is built upon solid economic fundamentals. With China's superiority in hard power, why should the dollar remain the sole global currency? Even if China pursues peaceful competition and has no intention of directly toppling the US hegemony, it's only reasonable for the US to share some of its financial dominance. In essence, China aims to claim a share of the dollar's market for the Chinese yuan. This, I believe, is China's true objective and the reason behind its willingness to take such a bold stance in the tariff war. Is a $360 billion trade surplus significant? Certainly. But if, through this tariff war, China can undermine the dollar's dominance and significantly advance the internationalization of the yuan, even if it can't replace the dollar entirely, but can capture a third or a quarter of its market share, that green paper pales in comparison to the long-term strategic gains. If the Chinese yuan also becomes a global currency, we could directly use the red paper printed by Chinese mints to exchange for resources, goods, and even gold in international trade. Why would we still need to toil to trade our goods for US dollars? When China obtains the global seigniorage, even if only partially, and as countries around the world significantly increase the share of yuan-denominated settlements and even reserves, China will be able to stimulate the economy by directly printing money, promote benign inflation, increase national income, and boost domestic demand. By then, not only could we easily fill the $360 billion demand gap, but we could also create, or rather divert from the dollar-dominated credit system, 2 or 3 more such $360 billion demands. This is the magic of finance and the allure of a global currency. To enable ourselves to enjoy, at least partially, the privilege that the American people have of creating purchasing and consumption power with paper money, we must undermine the credibility of the US dollar and replace many of the scenarios where the dollar is used with the yuan. Originally, this process was expected to be very long drawn out. However, Trump's tariff war has provided a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to accelerate the internationalization of the yuan. On the surface, Trump is extorting the world with tariffs. In essence, he is using the US dollar to extort the global community. In Trump's logic, if you don't agree to pay high tariffs, your goods can't enter the US. This not only means that other countries' products are barred from the world's largest single consumer market, but, more importantly, that they can no longer obtain US dollars. Since the US dollar is the only currency in international trade, without dollars, it's as if there's no money. Business with the US becomes impossible, and so does business with other countries. This is the source of Trump's overbearing and reckless behavior. For other countries, the lack of US dollars is more lethal than the loss of the US market. But if the US dollar is no longer the only global currency and there is an alternative, the harm of reciprocal tariffs will be greatly reduced. Countries will no longer be forced to lower the prices of their products through measures like currency devaluation to obtain US dollars and pay high tariffs to subsidize American consumers. And the currency that aims to replace the US dollar is the Chinese yuan. The process of yuan internationalization is a process in which the yuan nibbles away at the US dollar's global market share. Previously, China faced numerous difficulties in promoting the internationalization of the yuan. The US dollar had been the dominant global currency for decades, creating a strong historical inertia. When the yuan emerged, although it was backed by the world's largest industrial power and could be used to purchase desired industrial products just like the dollar, there was no compelling reason for the world to abandon the familiar and globally recognized US dollar in favor of the newcomer yuan. More importantly, there were significant doubts about the credibility of the yuan and China. China has developed rapidly in recent years, showing signs of catching up with and even surpassing the US, which has led to it being strategically targeted by the US. Naturally, the US cannot accept China challenging its status or the yuan replacing the dollar, even partially. Thus, on the one hand, the US has been using means such as trade wars, technology wars, and financial wars to contain China. On the other hand, it has demonstrated its determination that there can be no two tigers in one mountain and that the US and China must compete for superiority. When the perception that the US and China are bound to have a showdown becomes mainstream globally, people will naturally be cautious about the yuan and yuan-denominated assets. After all, in the traditional view, the US is more powerful than China. In the years of US-China rivalry, the US has been on the offensive and China on the defensive. In this context, if China cannot withstand the pressure in its game with the US, the yuan will depreciate significantly, its usage scenarios will shrink, and the wealth of countries and individuals holding yuan and Chinese assets will decline sharply. Moreover, during the intense US-China rivalry, abandoning the dollar for the yuan is seen as taking the opposite side in the eyes of the US and will inevitably invite US suppression. If China ultimately loses, the negative impacts will be magnified even more. In short, the general outlook on the outcome of the US-China game is not optimistic, and the uncertainty of the yuan in the eyes of global capital cannot be eliminated, making internationalization extremely difficult. China could only take advantage of occasional opportunities, such as providing debt swaps to countries facing financial crises, or when some countries, like Russia, have no choice but to turn to the yuan due to the inability to use the US dollar to gain a small share of the market that originally belonged to the US dollar. In recent years, China has demonstrated numerous technological breakthroughs and a boom in the military industry, which has increased global confidence in China to some extent. However, historical inertia still persists. China's passive position in the US-China game has not changed, and the deep-rooted perception of the US being stronger than China cannot be dispelled in the short term. If things continue along this path, the internationalization of the yuan can only progress slowly. Before reaching a critical point of qualitative change, all countries, including China, will still have to pay taxes to the US, remain vulnerable to US extortion, and even be at risk of being harvested by the US. However, with the implementation of reciprocal tariffs and Trump's exorbitant demands, countries have been pushed to a corner. If they don't want to be exploited and have their resources and goods produced through hard work cheaply plundered by the US, they have no choice but to use the yuan as much as possible in international trade. As more and more international trade is denominated and settled in yuan, and as central banks of various countries even use the yuan as a reserve currency, the demand for the yuan will skyrocket, and the conditions for China to print money and inject liquidity will mature. The newly issued money will be shared by the increasingly large yuan-using world, which will not only avoid hyperinflation, but also drive up the national income level and stimulate domestic demand. The expansion of China's domestic demand and consumption, in turn, provides an incremental market for global producers, offsetting the losses from reduced exports to the US. Eventually, the yuan-using world will move towards recovery and prosperity, while a large amount of US dollars will lose their global application scenarios and the function of a global currency, being forced back to the US, triggering hyperinflation in the dollar-using world. This is the fundamental reason why China hopes Trump will wage a tariff war. Even if he doesn't, China will push and force him to do so. Without reciprocal tariffs, there is no incentive for countries to change their currency using habits. The higher the reciprocal tariffs, the more desperate countries become, and the faster they will abandon the US dollar and embrace the yuan. Based on this logic, after Trump's tariffs were implemented and China took a strong counter-measure, the market performance did not meet Trump's expectations. Instead of a large amount of capital flowing from US stocks to US bonds, there was a triple kill in stocks, bonds, and foreign exchange. A large part of the reason is that China's resolute action has made the world realize that the US dollar is facing huge value risks. If the US dollar is replaced by the yuan, even partially, the real value of the US dollar will be greatly reduced. This value loss cannot be compensated for by the meager yield of US bonds. When the expected capital flow from US stocks to US bonds instead turned into capital flowing out of the US and abandoning the US dollar, the once arrogant Trump had no choice but to back down. This is the logic behind our victory in this round of the tariff war. However, many people still worrying that this victory is only temporary. After all, for now, the Trump administration has only pressed the pause button and given a 90-day tariff grace period to non-retaliating countries. During this period, he will surely use both coercion and inducement to divide and conquer these countries and force them to take sides with the US. The US is still the world's hegemon and the leader of the global economic order, with much greater global influence than China. It is foreseeable that these countries, including the EU, which has participated in the counter-measures, will most likely yield to Trump in the end. Although China has made it clear that it will not allow other countries to trade away China's interests in exchange for concessions from the United States, a concerning scenario looms. What if all other nations yield to US pressure, are forced to buy so-called century-long US treasuries, and are dragged onto America's geopolitical bandwagon? Even if they don't directly undermine China's interests now, when Trump launches another offensive, China could find itself isolated. How should it respond? This seemingly daunting challenge is, in fact, less worrisome than it appears. Even if China stands alone against the United States, as long as other countries do not collectively impose tariffs on China following the US's lead, China remains invincible. Let's dissect the logic behind this assertion. For China, the key lies in the lack of coordinated, US-led tariff hikes from other nations. Most low to mid-end Chinese goods can still reach the US market through rerouting and rebranding. The additional cost, mainly in the form of handling fees, is often borne largely by US consumers. China's industrial system enjoys an overwhelming edge over global competitors. A marginal increase in costs won't erode its market share. As for high-end electronics and technology products that are difficult to rebrand, Chinese branded smartphones and cars have long been blocked from the US market. The exports of these items to the US primarily consist of products manufactured in China by US companies. These high-tech goods rely so heavily on China's industrial ecosystem that the US would suffer far more than China if Trump were to impose strict tariffs. Here's the crucial point. If the US-China tariff war escalates and leads to a full-scale decoupling, third-party countries face a dilemma. While they can earn US dollars by exporting their own products or wash Chinese goods to the US, they cannot be certain of using those dollars when purchasing from China. Once the US and China decouple, China has significantly less need for US dollars. In fact, China's demand for dollars has been dwindling for some time. The US has restricted exports of key items, leaving China with an abundance of dollars with few places to spend them. For essential imports like oil and chips, China's growing new energy sector and cooperation with countries like Saudi Arabia and Russia on yuan-denominated oil trade have reduced its reliance on the dollar for energy. Meanwhile, China's rapid progress in chip technology has accelerated the decline in dollar demand for semiconductor imports. With a $3 trillion foreign exchange reserve, China has ample buffer to maintain exchange rate stability and withstand financial shocks, rendering large-scale dollar hoarding unnecessary. China might not completely reject dollar-denominated transactions in its trade with other countries. However, It will likely create certain regulatory hurdles and costs for dollar-based payments while offering incentives and conveniences for yuan-based transactions. For third-party countries, importing Chinese industrial products is a necessity, often more pressing than obtaining US dollars. Previously, under the international trade norm of dollar dominance, this was a straightforward process. Now, the cost of acquiring dollars has increased, with at least a 10% base tariff to pay even if Trump lifts reciprocal tariffs. On top of that, using dollars to buy from China incurs additional costs. In contrast, yuan-denominated transactions come with discounts and ease of use. Economically speaking, the choice is clear. These countries will increasingly opt to trade with China in yuan, as third-party countries rely on the dollar for exports to the US but shift to the yuan for imports from China. A structural imbalance will emerge, a shortage of yuan and a surplus of dollars. Continuing to use dollars for Chinese imports means incurring double costs: first, to earn the dollars by paying tariffs to the US, and then to use them in China. This makes yuan-based transactions far more appealing. As more goods, whether consumer products or industrial components, are purchased with yuan, these countries will also prefer to receive yuan when exporting agricultural products, resources, and services to China. Once this trade pattern solidifies, their demand for the dollar will shrink significantly, and the process of replacing the dollar with the yuan will accelerate, especially given the added costs of earning dollars due to Trump's tariffs. Fundamentally, currency derives its value from goods. The currency exists to trade commodities. Without tangible goods as a backing, currency is worthless. The United States has long relied on Chinese goods, much like oil, as a cornerstone of the dollar's value. But with a US-China decoupling, China's goods no longer support the dollar. Instead, they become a driving force for the yuan to compete with the dollar. Stripped of this crucial support, the dollar's value system teeters on the brink of collapse. This is the underlying logic that ensures China's invulnerability in the tariff war and explains why China has used Trump's tariff threats to its advantage, leaving him in a political quagmire. In the past, China refrained from such bold strategies. Its industrial dominance was less pronounced, leaving it vulnerable to competition from other countries. Technologically, China was confined to the lower and middle segments of the industrial chain, facing the risk of US supply chain disruptions. Moreover, China's comprehensive national strength was insufficient to withstand potential political and military retaliation from the US. These factors forced China to exercise restraint. However, the situation has changed dramatically. China's industrial superiority is now unassailable, proven by record-breaking exports during the 7-year trade war. Technological breakthroughs have plugged the gaps in China's innovation landscape, eliminating the threat of Western technological blockades. In terms of overall national power, China has not only caught up but also surpassed the US in military technology. The stage is set for China to assert itself. Trump, oblivious to these shifts, not only failed to de-escalate but instead handed China the perfect opportunity, accompanied by a gift of global reciprocal and base tariffs. It was an offer too good to pass up, an alignment of stars that China could not afford to ignore in the context of this once-in-a-century transformation. In essence, China lured Trump into a strategic trap, using a $360 billion trade surplus as bait. Now, the tables have turned. China is poised to challenge the US dollar, seigniorage rights, and America's financial hegemony. It remains to be seen whether Trump can extricate himself from this predicament. Judging by the reactions in US financial markets, even his self-proclaimed winning narrative seems to have failed to convince investors.